All right. Now we're official because I'm recording. Yeah, it's when you know we're in. All right, let's see if I can find a screen to share. Nope. So let me open the Word document. It's Constitution Day. How do I not know this? I'm supposed to know stuff like this, aren't I? I did not know. Are you sure it's Constitution Day? For some reason, I thought that was in the fall. Oh, of course. Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm glad that we recorded that. No, I was thinking about, how the legislature proclaimed Constitution Week, and our state legislature, I don't know if you follow them much, they're a little quirky. They get concerned about what history teachers are teaching. So, they tell us there are certain things we need to teach or apparently not teach. So we're kind of in the critical race theory mode right now. So. Not that I definitely don't want to talk about any of that kind of stuff with you guys. Politics. Oh, politics. All right, let's look at, we can start with the Unit 2 questions maybe. See if I can make those visible. Where'd you guys go? There you are. All right. Goodness. Yes, it's Constitution Day. Oh dear. All right. Kind of tells you how my morning is. Man, the whole week has been kind of messy like that. I feel like I need to issue a general apology to all of you. But all right. So today's question: how did the framers of the Constitution balance competing claims of local self-government, sectional interests, and national authority? Yeah. So we'll talk pretty specifically about that. Oh, sorry, and I'll add some page numbers for you in when we get there. So we'll keep that handy. All right, and let's see, let's unshare. Can I unshare? Is that the right word? And let's go to notes. And then we'll probably talk a little more about the document question. I guess we might as well look at that right now too. What the heck? What the heck? So on the document question, excuse me for the throat clearing, which will probably happen some. On the document question, um, I couldn't remember because I wasn't really around back then. If Washington actually gave this as a speech, or if he just like published it and said, "Hey, everybody, read it." And I think the way that it worked, I was looking at some stuff before class. I know that he had published it. I know that for certain, and that and for some reason I couldn't remember if it was Madison or Hamilton that helped write it. So I went back and looked, and there was a reason I was confused about it. So I didn't feel so bad about it then. Madison helped him write his first inaugural address, or at and this farewell address was patterned after that. And Hamilton helped write this, but he apparently took Madison's as a model and did it in the same format. And of course, they're both trying to match Washington's tone. And Washington, of course, is, the editorial force on this. So he is certainly contributing. So it looked to me from the stuff that I was reading this morning that it certainly was published. I knew that it was, but he gave part of it more publicly as well, not the whole thing. And I guess the whole thing initially was like 30 pages, something like that. So it's a pretty long speech. And I think because they were issuing it as a written document and that the original document was handwritten, so it probably was a little bit longer. Yeah. Uh-oh. Goodness. No, somebody, sorry, I was just reading somebody's difficulties this morning. So now I'm not feeling as bad about my start of the day, but yeah. But no, I appreciate it when you guys let me know if stuff's going on. But don't worry. I mean, I know crowd, we lost power yesterday for a while because apparently a buzzard flew into a power substation. Could be true. I think it was the Russians, but what do I know? Isn't the Russians? Probably. All right. So Washington's going to be the author of this, of course. And Washington is president at the time. And he is letting people know that he's only going to run for, he's not going to run for a third term. And this is pretty monumental because what we had noticed, European leaders didn't like to give up power. So Washington is essentially giving up a job that he could have had for the rest of his life. So giving up power is seen as kind of an unusually noble sort of thing to do. And it's going to make quite an impression that Washington, first of all, says, hey, I'm not coming back. You'll have to get a new president. Intended audience, it's going to be the American people, but it's going to be Congress as well. And this is a written document, and it's going to be delivered in part orally, but it's going to be printed in, I think it's a newspaper that it's initially printed in. And, Washington, of course, is going to be summing up his presidency. We haven't even talked about his presidency yet. So sorry, we're going to do that, I promise. So he's going to sum up his presidency, and he's going to give advice for, his predecessor, no, antecedent, the people who follow him. And he's also going to give advice to the country. And the excerpt that I've put in specifically talks about the United States and foreign alliances, how the United States should deal with foreign countries, and what sort of relationships they should have and what sort they should avoid. And of course, Washington's goal is that he wants to see the United States succeed as a country for a very long time. Yeah. So he's giving advice that he thinks will put the United States on a path to success. The two big things he talks about in the whole document are how he thinks political parties are going to be disruptive and destructive to the unity of our country. And the excerpt, of course, that I've given you talks about how he feels the United States should deal with foreign affairs. So the significance of the document, importance, you don't have any reason. I don't think there's any reason to distrust it. I guess I shouldn't tell you you shouldn't distrust it. You get to decide that. But, there's so many copies of it. It was published. It was delivered publicly. I don't know of anybody who thinks that it was transcribed improperly. We have, somewhere, I don't have it, but somewhere in the National Archives or Library of Congress or somewhere like that, they probably have the original copy, or they have a manuscript. Or I don't think there's any reason to doubt the credibility of the document. But strengths and weaknesses, it's going to be from Washington's perspective, of course, and not everybody's going to agree with Washington. And by this time, we've already started to develop political parties, which Washington's going to warn us against. And Washington's probably the only guy who could have managed all, both those factions and kind of kept them together without them fighting too much. Although, you'll notice when we go through this, they squabble enough that some of his cabinet resigns and people get upset with each other. And I know that Burr shoots Hamilton because they made a musical, right? But that doesn't happen, of course, during this presidency. But some of that conflict develops during this presidency, although those two seem to hate each other for a long time. But yeah, I'm sorry, we definitely don't want to make this about anything other than Washington saying goodbye and giving advice. So I think this is fairly straightforward. I could be wrong, but when you talk about the general message of the document, throw a quote in there. I think number 4 is probably the best place to have quotes. That's probably the place where it makes the most sense. And the other stuff is probably, it's a little more straightforward, just names and places and dates and things like that. All right. Okay. So document analysis. Yeah. And the third one, I think, is one of the ones that I just took from the book. Oh, there's a weird squirrel on the back porch. As long as they don't come in the house, right? Okay. Yeah, the third one is the third document analysis assignment. I think I put in your textbook, so or used an example from your textbook. So you want to. I think I gave the warning yesterday. If you don't have a textbook, you better find a friend that can shoot you a copy of this. Why don't you have a textbook? You have a textbook. All right. Let's look at the notes. John. Okay. All right. I'm sorry for Jonathan. Yeah. How did he tell you? Was it in the group me? You don't have to answer that, by the way. All right. Let me look for the next document. So we could talk about time question review now. Let's just go over the notes. Let's do that. Yeah. Oh, that is something different. Notes. There we go. All right. Too many tabs open. So confusing. All right. Yeah, group me. Group me. Oh, goodness. Oh, I don't want to sneeze at you, but it's probably going to happen. Goodness. Ah. Okay, sorry. All right. I feel like we talked about most of the stuff. Yeah, we talked about all the stuff in 6. I don't know what was up with me in these notes. Yeah, I for some reason kind of kicked in a little bit better for chapter 8, but maybe between now and the fall I'll improve the notes. Okay, Constitution. Constitution. My goodness. Oh, okay. I'll look to. He didn't pop up in the waiting room. I'm not doubting you, by the way. Let me see if I can find him. Where'd he go?
I got a notification that my car was ready.
Your car's ready. Uh-oh. We'll mute you. Okay. At least somebody's car's ready. That's good. All right. No, it's tough when you guys got to manage your life in the middle of all this stuff. I don't see anybody that I haven't let in. Oh, poop. Technology. Whose idea was this? All right. Crud. Let me unshare and see if it shows up a different way. I don't. He may have to log in again or something. I don't know. Unless it's just sort of. I'm scrolling and don't see Jonathan. Okay. Oh, there he is. He just showed up. All right. Okay. So we found out stuff. Yeah, somebody's car's ready. Jonathan's in. Did I check off Jonathan? Yes. Okay. Let's go back to the notes. Let's see if they're still open. Okay. Let's talk about the Constitution. Here's what I know about the Constitution from last soccer season, because I got to talk with lots of soccer parents about the Constitution, which isn't what I normally talk to soccer parents about. I usually try to explain the offside rule to them, which is fairly complicated as well. But here's what the soccer parents and I run a small soccer league, and we talked quite a bit about how the Constitution doesn't really talk about masks. That's what we talked about a lot last season. Okay. So in the Constitution, no discussion of masks. However, the Constitution is, our blueprint, I suppose, for our government. It's a relatively short document. It's not nearly as short, of course, as the what's the other thing? Declaration of Independence. However, it's pretty short for constitutions. I don't know if you've ever looked at the Texas Constitution. That thing's ridiculous. No offense. Texas needs to be revised. Please don't get upset with me. But it's like 300 pages. What the heck? And it talks about the dog catcher in Burnett County or something. Come on, Texas. Don't add that kind of stuff to your Constitution. But the United States Constitution, relatively short, relatively few amendments. I think we have 27 at this point. and 10 or 11, depending on how you want to look at it, all kind of came at the same time. So yeah, it's been a nice document that we're pretty excited about. But we started off with a document we were less excited about, which was the Articles of Confederation. But we had to write something. We're in the middle of a revolution. That was like our first attempt, our first draft maybe, and we kept it for a while. So our first Constitution of the United States truly is the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation were written during the Revolution. So written in 1777 and ratified 1781, I think it is. And then Constitution, I think we start writing in 83 and ratify in 87, maybe. I don't know. It's a sign to you that I'm not going to ask you about dates on this. So Articles of Confederation, referred to often because it's a quote from the document, as a firm league of friendship. And so this is supposed to kind of enshrine in independence, sovereignty among the states, and really agreements for them to work together on certain things. So the goal of the Articles of Confederation really is to maintain individual state autonomy, and they do a fine job of that. What we figure out pretty quickly is if you have a document that maintains individual state autonomy, there are certain things that it's not going to provide well for. And that will be the issue. Things like defense and foreign affairs, and we didn't actually have a judiciary. And yeah, there are going to be some things that are a little messy. The national government does have the ability to make war, excuse me, conduct foreign affairs, make treaties, that sort of stuff, but no financial resources. And the no financial resources part is going to be the major weakness of this, because as people who are adults or close to adults, for some of you who are a little bit younger, your independence really doesn't mean anything if you have no financial resources. Yeah. So you can't pay your bills. It's really hard for you to operate as an adult. And our country is going to realize that as well. So the major weaknesses of the Articles: they didn't have financial resources. They couldn't coin money. They couldn't levy taxes, and they couldn't keep states from having their own currencies. So each individual state had its own currencies as well. And the United States had a currency called the Continental, which was pretty highly inflationary. I'm checking off some people as they come in again. All right. Excuse me. A couple of things that are done fairly well under the Articles of Confederation. We did win the Revolutionary War. That was good. Good job. And there'll be a map in your book on 256 that talks about how they incorporated new land. So when we gain new land from the war, different states will claim that land. And so states claiming that land, that's going to be kind of an interesting issue. So when those states want to be, or when those states claim the land, and then that land is going to be divided and ruled by either the states or by the federal government, they'll have to create land ordinances that define how that's going to happen. So that's a little tricky, because the different states are going to fight over who should have control over certain pieces of land. Also, the states that were landlocked, there aren't too many of them, but states that don't have any coastal access are going to suffer some, and the states don't cooperate very well. The land ordinance that we'll talk about probably the most is the Northwest Ordinance, 1787. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about the land ordinance is it sets up these little grids. And so township grids one of the township grids will be devoted to public school. There'll be taxing ordinances. So they set up how the town should be governed. They set up taxing structures. They allow for public schools, but they also, in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, banned slavery. And so that will be, an interesting development, and also will be somewhat controversial for some of the southern states, as you might imagine. Not very excited about that. And typically, like the Northwest Ordinance is going to say, in this land that we're governing, eventually there'll be 3 to 5 states. That's the ordinance that develops. I think that's the one that does Ohio and Michigan and Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin. So some corn growing states. Yeah. And it's going to ban, I already mentioned that it bans slavery. It's going to set up public school, and it will also discuss what the relations with natives will be. And sometimes they're going to pay natives for their land. Sometimes they're going to set up a place for natives to go because they've taken their land. That's, Rust Belt in the modern era. Yeah. I guess when I was younger, it would have been the Steel Belt, but that hasn't worked out so well in the modern era. Yeah. So that production has shifted overseas. All right. There's a section where it talks about the weaknesses of the Confederation, and almost all of it has to do with money and foreign policy. And the one thing that it does mention pretty consistently, which is true, is that this era, whether it's under the Confederation or the Constitution, is a really good era. Sorry for yawning again. Is a really good era for land speculators. So people who go in and buy land as an investment and then resell it or broker those sales. Those guys are going to make a lot of money. You're also going to have banks that are set up during this time period that will issue paper money, and that paper money is not regulated by the federal government. So that's going to be highly inflationary. So it's going to be messy stuff. And trade is going to be a problem. So people are going to want to buy manufactured goods. We don't really have manufactured goods. So honestly, England is going to profit quite a bit from the United States during this time period, and will also try to start some overseas trade with other countries besides England, with limited amounts of success. Some success, not so much success, but it's pretty inflationary time period. People are going to have to pay pretty high taxes. It's going to be difficult for them to pay some of these taxes because the federal currency is essentially worthless, and then state currency is going to vary from its value is going to vary as well. So tricky stuff, and it's going to lead to states setting up tax systems that many people will think are slightly unfair, which leads us to Shays' Rebellion, or Shays' Rebellion. So Daniel Shays, with the S on his last name, is a Revolutionary War hero. He's big time. I mean, he got one of you remember the Marquis de Lafayette? I know you guys hung out. He was one of the French commanders who came over and served with George Washington, and certainly his help in leading his own troops and training US troops and combining was, very important in the Revolutionary War effort, as was, the French alliance, as we may have mentioned yesterday. And the Marquis de Lafayette gave 5 of his swords away as tokens of his respect for people that he thought had made, very noble contributions, had fought bravely, that sort of thing. Daniel Shays received one of those. So Shays was a legitimate war hero. People would have known who he was at the time period. So people know him, and people like him and think highly of him. So He is a farmer in Western no, wrong state, Western Massachusetts. I don't know, to me, I didn't live in the East, so to me, all the states are the same in the East, all the small states. But yeah, I know that Massachusetts and Pennsylvania would not consider themselves small states, but very important historically, of course. So Daniel Shays lives in Western Massachusetts, and the government is primarily controlled, the state government, primarily controlled by merchants from Boston, And these merchants, of course, have state debt that they need to pay. And Massachusetts is, they got a lot of debt. So they need to pay off their debts, and they need to tax someone to do it. So they can either tax trade, which is what they do for a living, or they can tax farmland, which is what someone else does for a living. So, in a very fine sort of British tradition, they decide to tax the people they aren't. So they tax the farmers. Daniel Shays is one of those farmers, and they tax the farmers so heavily that many of them are going bankrupt. They're going to have to sell their farms to pay off their taxes. That is a rough thing, man. If your taxes are so high, you got to sell your farm to pay them off. That's terrible. It could either mean that you didn't plan well, it could mean that your crops didn't come in, or it could mean that your government's being unfair. And that's how Shays and his neighbors interpreted this. So they decided they just weren't going to take it anymore. So they made their own little militia. They gathered up their pitchforks and their swords from the Marquis de Lafayette or whatever they had, and they stormed the bankruptcy courts. Yes, they stormed the bankruptcy courts. Now, they didn't hurt anybody. I don't think they hurt anybody when they went in there, but they were very insistent that the bankruptcy courts needed to shut down. Well, the judges in those bankruptcy courts really didn't want to die. And they said, good idea. So they shut down the bankruptcy courts. Now, the people in Boston saw this as lawlessness. The people in the countryside saw this as revolution. They're standing up for their rights. They're doing what the founding fathers did. And, some of the irony, of course, is that some of these Boston merchants were guys like Samuel Adams, who, thought Sons of Liberty were a great idea, but saw these guys as treasonous and, in need of execution. So they took this kind of hard. They didn't really value these guys' revolution nearly as much as they valued their own. But that makes sense, doesn't it? So the Boston merchants end up hiring kind of a private army, and they go to put down the Shays rebels. They arrest a bunch of folks and declare that they've restored order, that sort of thing. And what will eventually happen is Shays and lots of his folks will be pardoned. And let's see. If there's something important that I'm leaving out, I'm peeking at the book just to make sure. No, I think that's the main stuff. Yeah. Okay. I'm kind of trying to remind myself if they added a whole lot of other stuff. It says rebels are dispersed. More than 1,000 were arrested. Yeah, and the concern was that this had deteriorated into a state of anarchy. So, this is a big thing. So people are going to comment about it, and by people, I mean people in the federal government, like say George Washington and James Madison, and founding father kind of dudes. And remember, during the Articles of Confederation, all we had was a legislature. So they just had a Congress. So we didn't have a president. You had the president of the Confederation Congress, but he just set the agenda. So you didn't have a president. We didn't have a Supreme Court. So these are just famous people making comments. Now, most of the famous people kind of like law and order. So Washington, Madison, who else? Pretty much everybody except Jefferson are going to say, this was out of control. And here's the problem. We had a state that had a rebellion that had trouble putting it down. So could the federal government have intervened to help them put down this rebellion? And their answer was no, we really couldn't have been of any help. And if this spread, it could have become a national problem. Thomas Jefferson is the one who has that really famous quote, something like, the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. And then they put in, a little quote of his that says, a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. So Jefferson just says, now that's just Tuesday. This kind of stuff happens. And if they rise up and their concerns are heard and they make changes, then they were right, and that was good. If they rise up and their concerns are repressed, then they were wrong, and that's also good. So either way, little rebellion, just a natural state of things in a democratic republic. There you go. That's just normal. But Washington, Madison, pretty much every other founding father kind of person, Adams, John Adams, certainly Samuel Adams, but Samuel Adams had a lot of self-interest in this one. Henry Knox, the military commander as well, they're going to say, no, we have to have the rule of law. And we also have to remember that we can elect people now. So we don't have to have a rebellion every time there's a problem. We elect people to our state legislatures and to the federal legislature. So rather than having a rebellion, we have an election. That's kind of how we do things in the United States. I guess not everybody was convinced, were they? Okay. So the importance of Shays' Rebellion is that it gets people to have a discussion about what is the proper role of the federal government, if there's an incident in the states, and is the federal government as powerful as it needs to be in cases of emergency? Jefferson said, sure, it's fine. Everyone else said, I don't know. So people in the Confederation Congress decided that maybe it was a good idea to get together and talk about these sorts of things. Is the federal government strong enough to put down a rebellion? Should it have more powers? That sort of thing. Now, Confederation Congress, the way that thing worked is each state had one vote. Everybody had a delegation, but each state really only got one vote. Almost everything had to all their decisions either had to be 2/3 or completely unanimous. So if they wanted to revise the Articles of Confederation, which is why they were getting together to talk, that discussion would have to produce a unanimous consent. And they decided that they would meet in, I think it was September of 1786. So they got together at Annapolis. Yep, there it is, September of 1786. They got together at Annapolis, Maryland, and only delegates from about 6 states were able to come, which isn't quite enough. And the concern was that federal authority really was not acknowledged. And they agreed that it was probably a good idea to get every state together at a better time of year, so maybe the travel would be easier. So they decided that all of the states would send a delegation to a constitutional convention or a discussion about the Articles of Confederation in May of 1787, and that they would meet in Philadelphia. Now, the first problem with this meeting is that one of the states doesn't show up. So technically, it's kind of illegal. Excuse me. And Rhode Island is the one state that doesn't show up. And the book is going to assert that it's because they probably have the most developed foreign policy, trade policy, debt relief, that sort of thing. The things the other states were struggling with. So they figured, no, we've already kind of solved all of our problems. We don't really need to go to this. Plus, Rhode Island's kind of the, I don't want to say they're rowdy, but that was a state that was formed by dissenters. So these are guys who probably aren't going to agree on a whole lot of stuff. So sorry. Okay. So Constitutional Convention, you have the Annapolis Convention, which was kind of the pre-constitutional convention in September of '86, and then Philadelphia Convention, May of 1787. And this is going to last for a while. 12 of the 13 states will send a delegation. It's going to include some fairly important people like Ben Franklin, George Washington, James Madison. Is going to be absent a couple of important people as well: Thomas Jefferson, John Adams. John Adams is overseas doing some business, and Thomas Jefferson is overseas. They're both overseas serving as diplomats, I think. Well, I know Jefferson is in France and Adams is in England, because that's going to be a pattern for them. A lot of the Constitutional Convention folks were slave owners. It mentions nearly half were slave owners. There were some poor guys or people who started out as poor guys. Alexander Hamilton's always our best example of that. Lots of folks, most probably came from some wealth. And these guys, as a rule, are going to be lawyers, merchants, planters, large farmers, and they probably are going to be more educated and more affluent than the average person in the United States. Mentions that half of these people had college education, which is ridiculous for the time period. It says during this time period, fewer than 0.1% of Americans attended college. That was 1/10 of 1%. Yes. So nobody went to college back then, because you didn't have to go to college for any reason except, to be a minister in certain denominations. So going to college was, a sign that your family had extra money, typically. It wasn't necessarily for a job or that kind of thing. It's like, we have some extra money, let's send the kid to college. So almost half of these folks had gone to college, which was pretty unusual. Goodness. Excuse me, some weird thing popped up on my screen. Sorry. And their concern is that they want to, I think the quote in your book says, curb the excesses of democracy in some ways, but they want to create a more orderly process for dispute, debate. They don't want to see any more Shays, rebellions, that sort of thing. So they want to figure out how federal authority can work with state authority to keep things under control as needed, but also create a more orderly system. So it's not necessarily just about suppressing rebellions. It's certainly not. They've figured out that certain things are working and certain things are not working. And of course, anything that requires money is not working under the Articles of Confederation. So, all right, here we go. Constitutional compromises. So I think we had our general talk about the attendees at the Constitutional Convention. Wealthier than the average person, more educated than the average person, representatives from 12 of the 13 states, and they were able to arrive at consensus pretty quickly on certain things. I did mention that Hamilton was there, right? I know, we love Hamilton. So Congress needs, one of the things that they could agree on is that Congress really needed to be able to raise money. Yeah, so the federal government was going to need money. So they had to create an ability to tax and to collect those taxes, because under the Articles of Confederation, they could ask for money. They just couldn't force the states to turn, to actually send the money. Yesterday, there's a reason for the story. I went to the post office yesterday to mail something to my dad because, it's Father's Day this weekend. So I got him a very important shirt that said, "Dad Joke Champ." We'll see if he wears it. Yeah, because every dad has jokes, right? And what I noticed is there were really, really excessively long lines at the post office yesterday. It's like, why is everybody at the post office? Did they all forget to mail their things to their dad? What the heck? And then I saw people with their tax forms. It was tax day extended version, which I'd completely forgotten about because I took care of my taxes several months ago because I would forget if I didn't do it when I thought I should. But clearly the federal government has figured out how to tax us. So, but the government needs money to do stuff, all the things, the free things that people want the government to do. There has to be money for those things. Or if you just want something like an army, you have to pay those folks. They like to be paid. So that part, just kind of had to happen. So they have to figure out a way to raise money without relying on the states to send in that money. Now, if there would not have been long lines at the post office yesterday if there were not penalties for people who did not pay their taxes. The IRS is tricky like this, and they notice when you don't pay. They do. Yeah, I had a grandmother who didn't pay for like 6 or 7 years. I don't know why she took 6 or 7 years off, but she did. I do know why she took 6 or 7 years off. When my grandfather died, he clearly was the one who took care of those things. And I don't know if she just didn't care or, just kind of slipped her mind. But after he passed away, she just didn't pay taxes. That's an error. Yeah, you shouldn't do that. I believe that was a costly error for her. But yeah, if there weren't penalties and there weren't an enforcement agency, you end up with what we had during the Articles of Confederation, where the states went, yeah, great idea, we're not sending any money. Also, things that they agreed on, they would create a legislature, a national judiciary, because, the states had different disputes with each other or with the federal government. You needed a branch of the government to solve that. And an executive, essentially like a governor for a state, you would have a version of that for the federal government. And if you ever have some free time, you could read the notes on the Constitution. Now, they had lots of agreements in the Constitutional Convention. One was that what they talked about, what happens at the Constitutional Convention stays at the Constitutional Convention. Apparently, it was a lot like Vegas. So they drank quite a bit too, which I hear is a lot like Vegas as well. But they decided that rather than having the press cover everything they did, talk about everything they did, and people go like, I can't believe they're talking about that. They wanted to allow their compromises to be in secret. So this way, the things that they were talking about wouldn't get out, and then people wouldn't get upset and go like, can you believe they're thinking about this? Oh my gosh. Can you believe they're thinking about that? And then people would petition them or storm the Pennsylvania State House where they're having the discussion. So they wanted to keep their discussions quiet. So they weren't really allowed to take notes. They weren't allowed to talk to the press. And they would get in trouble if they did any of this stuff. They had a sergeant at arms or president. I think he was, Washington served as this person, and he was supposed to keep people in line. And if they went out to the bars afterwards, which apparently they did quite a bit and talked too much, he would get on to them. It's like, hey, you need to be quiet when you're out at the bar. So they were supposed to keep stuff secret. James Madison. Do you guys know anything about James Madison? I'm a huge fan of James Madison for a couple of reasons. One, principal author of the Constitution. Two, a sign that nerdy people can have some success in life. I know that Thomas Jefferson is kind of a nerdy dude, but he's also kind of an out there, cool dude and a nerdy dude at the same time. Madison's just kind of a nerdy dude. He's born into wealth. He's supposed to be own a plantation, that kind of thing, and run it. He's a little dude. He's like a 5 foot tall dude, and he likes to study things. So when Madison finds out, it's not a secret, that there's going to be a constitutional convention, what he does is studies every constitution of every republic ever for 6 months. And so he writes out his own plan for the Constitution, which will be called the Virginia Plan. We'll talk about that here in a second. So he studies for about 6 months. He studies every constitution ever from a republic, looks at the successes and failures of all of those republics, and then comes to the convention ready to go. He's got his notes, he's got his plan. And he also understands that he's not cool. He understands this. But some other people are, like Edmund Randolph, the current governor of Virginia in that era. So he allows Edmund Randolph to present his plan because he's not as concerned about getting credit for it as he is about it passing. So he knows if a more popular guy presents it, maybe that will help as well. So the Virginia plan or the Randolph plan will be presented, and this is essentially Madison's plan. And it'll create a 2-house legislature. And it's got a lot of other details in it, which we will talk about here in a minute. And nobody else has a plan, so they're operating with Madison's plan. So Madison's kind of the studious dude who makes sure that he's ready to go. He's also the guy that every night when he goes home records stuff. So his notes from the Constitution become that big book, the Notes on the Constitution, which is about 1,000 pages of stuff. And it tells you the stuff that they talked about. It has notes from people's speeches. It talks about who argued for what. If you ever want to know details from the Constitution, because they weren't really supposed to record them, in real time, Madison's notes on the Constitution are probably the most important thing. I was fortunate to be able to do a constitutional fellowship at Georgetown University. And I was maybe less fortunate to get to read a lot of the notes on the Constitution, but it really was kind of important because, you found out why they did certain things. One of the things I had always been told about the 3/5 compromise, which we're about to talk about, is that they decided that slaves would be counted as 3/5 of the population because they thought they were 60% as intelligent as whites or 60% human or something like that. I've always been taught that, in elementary school, kind of carried on through middle school. And then in high school, I just had some football coaches and they just didn't really care. No offense to football coaches, because some of them are really good teachers. I'm not trying to cause trouble here in Texas. I'm sorry. But, they just, I didn't learn a lot in high school history. That's what I'm trying to say. My fault, possibly, because I could have chosen to learn more. But, the teachers had other things going on too. So I didn't really get dispelled of this myth that that's why the 3/5 compromise was reached. And if you read in the notes on the Constitution, it really was just a negotiation. There was no reason they picked 3/5 except that's what they agreed on. That's it. There was no philosophical reason at all. It was just a compromise. And to me, for some reason, that was a big deal. I remember reading that and going like, who knew? But you can find out all sorts of little details if you want to weed through that thing. It's pretty big. Okay. So constitutional compromises. Virginia plan is the one that Madison comes in with that creates the 2-house legislature. In his version, both the houses, what becomes the Senate and what becomes the House of Representatives, would have been by population. So smaller states with smaller populations didn't like that, so they wanted at least one of the houses potentially to be equal representation. They will counter with the New Jersey plan, and the New Jersey plan says a single house legislature with equal representation, which was essentially the same as the Articles of Confederation. So what they will do instead is compromise. It's the Great Compromise, where they will combine, they will have a 2-house legislature, one, the Senate with equal representation and 6-year terms, and one, the House with proportional representation. So the more people who live in your state, the more representatives you get. That's why Texas is super happy lately, because you know, we're getting more folks here, so we're getting more people in Congress. So you're represented proportionally in the House, excuse me, and those are the 2-year terms, and those are directly elected by the people. The Senate was supposed to be populated by the states. So the state would decide how their senators were elected. So this typically the House or the state Congress would pick somebody. Sometimes the state governor would pick people, but 6-year terms in the Senate, and those were appointed by some method within the state. And then the House of Representatives was proportional representation, directly elected every 2 years. And then in the Constitution, they'll delineate which House of Congress has the right to start certain bills. As you know, the Senate approves and confirms presidential appointees. The House starts bills of where you spend money. Why can't I think of the name of what bills are that you spend money? Appropriations, bills where you spend money. Goodness, I did go to college. You just can't tell every day. So bills of appropriation. So Virginia plan is Madison's plan, New Jersey plan is the counter, and then the Great Compromise is the compromise between those. They noticed that while the delegates agreed on most things, their disagreements on many things were very, very strong. So they created a grand committee where each state put a few people in, and that grand committee was supposed to work out the big compromises. And that grand committee was led by Ben Franklin, because he's old and wise, sort of, mostly. Yeah, mostly old and wise. Yeah. And he's the one that says we have a republic if we can keep it. Oh, goodness, I feel like I'm talking a lot. I probably am, aren't I? All right, more things we should talk about. Certainly, there's a big discussion about how do we elect a president? How many presidents should we have? If you read notes on the Constitution, their initial discussions, they thought, I don't know why, 7 presidents. Can you imagine 7 presidents? Oh my gosh, we can barely deal with 1. And they thought 7. And so they went from 7 to 3 and then eventually to 1. And they thought he should be popularly elected, but then it's like, oh my gosh, we could elect a crazy person because, you know, he could be persuasive and could lead the day-to-day voters astray. So they created the Electoral College, which is supposed to be kind of a filter for democracy because we wanted to prevent the public at large from being swayed by a what is it that they said, I can't remember what exactly they said, but by somebody who had, you know, a lot of personal magnetism, but maybe wasn't the best person for the job. So the Electoral College was created really to filter the voice of the people in case the voice of the people went astray. So the Electoral College would be appointed by the states, and they could decide how they picked their electors, that sort of thing. One of the things that you'll notice as you go through the Constitution is they do leave a lot of discretion to the states, even though they want to create a system where they can collect taxes, where they can put down rebellions, that sort of thing. They still leave a lot of discretion to the states. One of those ways, and it's part of the reason your vice president, our vice president, is coming to visit Austin today. One of the pieces of discretion that they leave is voting regulations. So that was intentionally left to state governments so states could decide, because some were more urban, some were more rural. You know, they figured that people at the state level understood the needs of their citizens better. So voting regulations, constitutionally are left to the states. So that's kind of interesting. Now, your question for this chapter is really how do they balance power between the states and federal government and individuals and that kind of thing? Where do you find those compromises? And they build a lot of things into the system. I think we just talked about one, the Electoral College. Certainly, the president is kind of, sort of, mostly elected by popular vote, but the Electoral College can serve as a check on the voice of the people. And then the House of Representatives can serve as a check on the Electoral College if the election remains in dispute. They build into the different branches of government certain checks and balances. So we have a division of power between the three different branches of government. And we also have the principle of federalism, where the states have certain powers and the federal government has certain powers. So there are all sorts of divisions of power and checks and balances built into our system in order to keep everybody in check. So, for example, the president can issue executive orders if he doesn't think the Congress is moving quickly enough to pass laws. And we've seen lots of this in the modern era. I mean, you saw Trump issue several, and then I think the only thing that Biden did for like the first week of his presidency was rescind those executive orders. So executive orders can be rescinded, taken back, or pushed back by the next president. They can also be potentially declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was supposed to check and balance the legislature, and also if there were disputes between the different, like one state to another, or the state and the federal government, the judicial branch was supposed to hear those. Now, the idea of judicial review, that's not, that doesn't happen right away, where they officially declare things to be unconstitutional. But I mean, part of the power, or the goal of the reason that we created the judiciary was to make sure that the people who are creating the laws and enforcing them were kind of on track. If you look at the article that devises the judiciary, it's pretty broad, and the judiciary sort of creates itself as it goes along, and becomes a co-equal branch once you get judicial review, where they can officially declare laws to be unconstitutional. But the president can veto laws, but the Congress can override those vetoes. The chief executive gets to appoint judges to the Supreme Court and the federal levels of courts as well. But the Congress, the Senate in particular, has to approve those appointments. The president can have his own advisors. Congress, also the Senate in particular, gets to appoint those or gets to approve those advisors. So Congress does have the power to borrow money, regulate commerce, declare war, but the president asks for a declaration of war. So there's all sorts of checks and balances. The federal government has certain powers. Other powers are reserved to the state. And it's kind of the whole purpose of the 10th Amendment, which tends to be one of our favorites in Texas, up there with the second, is that any power not directly given to the federal government is reserved for the states or the people. So all sorts of checks and balances in the Constitution, built in on purpose, intentionally, to prevent any one branch of the government from having too much power, or preventing any one person, like a president, from having too much power. Judges serve for life to preserve their independence from politics, and presidents serve, a certain number of terms. And if we don't like someone in our system, we don't have to have a revolution. We just wait 2, 4, or 6 years and elect someone else. So they built in a lot of stuff into our system to keep it peaceful, to give us chances to make changes as we need to. And we can even change our Constitution itself as needed. All right, I'm going to pause for just a second just to see if you have any questions. Also, I've been talking for an hour. It's a long time, so I need a little break, get some more water. All right, do you guys have any questions you guys want to ask? And then we'll go back to finishing out those compromises and then talking a little bit about the question of the day. But you've probably gathered that that section we just talked about, which is around page 265, going to be super crucial for you as you if you answer the question from this chapter. All right, do you guys have any questions? I'm going to pause for a second here in a minute and go get something else to drink. Days like this, I wish I drank coffee. Okay. All right, back to business. Okay, we're officially back. So thanks for a couple minutes off there to get a beverage. Coke Zero for the record. Kind of early, I know, but I need caffeine. Okay, the compromises we didn't talk about. Oh, I should put the notes back up, right? Yeah, that's a good notes. All right. Yeah, hopefully, I guess everybody's in. Yeah, I didn't leave anybody in the waiting room. All right. So, compromises we didn't talk about. We talked about Virginia and New Jersey. Slave trade and commerce compromise. So, there's a big argument in the Constitutional Convention about whether or not we should have slavery. This is a continuing argument that clearly goes through the Civil War and maybe even a little beyond. People recognized the, I guess we could say, hypocrisy or conflict between saying all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, but then some men got to own other men. So they recognize that as a problem from before we even wrote that down. So they're arguing, you'll see folks from Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and New York primarily arguing that slavery should not be allowed in the new government. But if you read the Constitution, the words slave and slavery are not even in the Constitution. So, and it's interesting too, because they thought that the words would denigrate the Constitution, but they were not really quite willing to get rid of the institution whose name would denigrate the Constitution. But they also understood that the states in the South wouldn't agree to the Constitution if they got rid of slavery. So what they end up deciding in this, I think this is a compromise that's not necessarily, it's not exactly mentioned directly in the book, the Slave Trade and Commerce Compromise, but what the discussion concludes, because everybody knows about the three-fifths compromise, which we'll discuss as well. But what they decide is that they will agree to end the slave trade. So the importation of foreign slaves in 20 years from the date of the signing of the Constitution, or 20 years from the discussion. It ends up happening, it does happen, they do ban the slave trade, and that ends up happening during Jefferson's presidency. And they do follow through on that. However, they also don't end slavery, they end the slave trade. So in ending the slave trade, excuse me, the ban, in exchange for ending the slave trade in 20 years, so they give the South 20 more years to import more slaves if they feel like they need to. The South will give up, the South sort of gives up the ability to start bills that regulate commerce, set tariffs, that sort of thing. Those end up those have to be started in the House of Representatives. And the reason that this harms the South and helps the North is the North has a much larger population always during that era. I don't think it's not true anymore because we have Texas and California. Do you consider California the South? I don't know. But during this era, the North has a much larger population. About 2/3 of the population lives in the North. I think about a third in the South. So if the North gets to start bills that regulate trade and commerce, then they are going to have the advantage. And they also are going to make those to where they have to pass by a majority rather than 2/3. So what that means is the North will always control tariff policy. So taxes on imported and exported goods will always be controlled by the North. This is why sometimes your 8th grade teacher will argue that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights and unfair tariff policy, that kind of stuff. The South is definitely hurt by tariff policy, but yeah, I would never, I would feel uncomfortable arguing that that's the reason, Civil War. But they're definitely harmed by it. And when you see protests over tariffs, which you're going to see from time to time, those almost always initiate in the South. One of the big exceptions is the whiskey tax, which is a Pennsylvania Revolution, which that's an interesting thing. We'll talk about that tomorrow. It's interesting because the president, who's George Washington, leads the army to suppress the rebellion. It's like, I wouldn't expect to see that in the modern era. Can you imagine Joe Biden leaving, or Donald Trump? I'm not trying to disrespect either one of them, but leading the military. And of course, neither of them would, because they, we don't do that in the modern era. Plus, they don't have military experience. But I remember, what's the movie where the president leads the military? The Independence Day. So that's an important piece of history. All right. So Slave Trade and Commerce Compromise gives 20 more years for the foreign importation of slaves in exchange for the House of Representatives being the side of the Congress that starts these bills, and also allowing a majority vote rather than a 2/3. Okay. Three-fifths compromise. The South already had a population disadvantage, so which is going to harm them in the House of Representatives, which is the proportional side of the Senate, of the Congress. So they wanted to be able to count their slaves as part of the population. And the people from the North go like, you don't want them to vote, you don't want them to have rights, but you want to be able to count them. So they ended up having a big discussion about if slaves should be counted or not. And the argument will last for quite a while, several days. It goes to that Grand Committee, and the Grand Committee decides 3/5. 3/5. So that's the compromise that they make. So they count 3/5 of the slave population for purposes of representation in the South, or in the House of Representatives. So it also assists with the electoral votes in the Electoral College, because as you may know, I don't know if you know much about the Electoral College, the number of Electoral College votes you get is equal to the number of representatives you have in Congress. So you get one for each senator and one for each congressman. So it means every state's guaranteed at least 3 electoral votes, because every state has 2 senators and 1 representative, and larger states have more. So the 3/5 compromise will help the South a little bit in the Electoral College and in Congress as well. And the book will mention again in the same section a lot of the discussion about taxation, representation, and slavery. So lots of discussion about slavery in the Constitution without actually naming slavery in the Constitution. Yeah, okay. Let's see. The book mentions that in that period until 1808, when the slave trade was declared illegal, there were 100,000 new slaves brought into the Americas or 170, let's see. Oh, no, that was just by certain states. So there were 170,000 in, let's see, Georgia and South Carolina 100,000, 170,000, I think, from the British Islands to the Americas. So there's going to be lots of slave importation in that time period. Now, when it becomes illegal, it doesn't necessarily mean it's terribly well enforced. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. The final version of the Constitution they add, of course, we the people rather than we the states, and they do some stylistic edits that are recommended by Gouverneur Morris, who's, I think he is a Pennsylvania guy, or is he a Massachusetts guy? I think he's Pennsylvania. I can't remember. But he's a really good lawyer from the time period as well. And part of the reason they did that was to signify that the power comes from the people, not the states. And it also is modeled after, I think it was the New Hampshire and Massachusetts constitutions. And they add the idea that of a preamble. So we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish these United States. Yeah, so apparently when we were kids, we had to memorize that sort of stuff. Now, not everybody's super excited about the Constitution. Most people think it's a very nice compromise of all of the different agendas that people came in with. And Congress is going to have kind of a general ability to conduct interstate commerce or to make laws regarding interstate commerce. So I'm going to give a lot of power to Congress. There's going to be checks and balances between the different branches of government. And most of the people in the convention think they did a pretty good job. Then it's time for propaganda. It's time for propaganda. So after this leaves the Constitutional Convention, excuse me, they have to take it to the states for their ratifying conventions to get the states to agree. Some of the ratifying conventions are pretty rowdy. Seems like the one in Pennsylvania is pretty rowdy. And I know the one in New York is pretty rowdy. You know, sometimes people are sort of locked in or locked out. There's lots of arguments. I think the one in New York is where John Jay and Alexander Hamilton came and made pretty impassioned arguments. But as these conventions were being planned and started, the Federalist Papers were written. And the Federalist Papers were a collection of articles, editorials that were published in newspapers at the time period, and they were written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. And Hamilton wrote the most, although Madison wrote a substantial number of them. And they're about, I don't think, I can't remember how many there are, because we always talk about like Federalist 10 and Federalist 51. But I think there's about 85 or 90 of them. It's a big collection. And these are editorials that take the common arguments and concerns about the Articles of Confederation and discuss them and give arguments that explain why we're doing what we're doing. The Constitution, the main argument is that the Constitution is there to protect American liberties, to preserve them, create some checks and balances in the federal government. But if you have a government that can't protect life, liberty, and property, as John Locke would say, then your government's not able to do all the things it needs to do. But you want to make sure as well that the government has the money to do the things that it's supposed to do, and that it has the power to enforce the laws that it creates. So the Articles of Confederation didn't have enforcement abilities and didn't have money, which you're going to need to be able to enforce the laws. So Federalist 10 and 51, of course, they're mentioned in the book talk about how the government has to be based on the will of the people, but also has to check the will of the people at the same time. And Madison is particularly concerned about a majority enforcing its will or its tyranny on the minority. So the tyranny of the majority is something that Madison talks about quite a bit. And that's also part of the reason that we have that the government has, that the president has veto power. And he also wanted the governor to, let me try again, the president to have the ability to veto some state laws as well. That isn't what ends up happening. But Madison's also going to argue that the size of the United States and the diversity of the people represented by those individual states is going to serve as another check and balance and a protection on minority rights. Now, when they're talking about minority rights, you know they're talking about political minorities, correct? Yeah, that is what they're talking about during this time period. And Madison definitely is the person who studied the most about flaws and strengths historically of other republics, and he's going to use that study in the Federalist Papers to make fairly persuasive arguments. Yeah, so I think what you get with Hamilton is the guy who's going to make the flashiest argument, going to be most persuasive, have that personal magnetism, that kind of thing. What you get with Madison and Jay are the guys, and not that Hamilton isn't brilliant, he is, but Madison and Jay, you get a more scholarly treatise in some ways. So they appeal to different audiences, which is smart. I mean, it is. There are going to be a group of people called anti-federalists who will rise. Federalists or nationalists? This is one of those things that gets confusing. Are you guys still with me? Are you paying attention? I know it's so. I've talked for a long time. You go like, oh my gosh, is she still talking? Yes, I am. I'm sorry. But Federalists and anti-federalists. This gets a little tricky because in this era, constitutional era, Federalists are guys who favor the ratification of the Constitution. So a Federalist says yes to the Constitution. So in this instance, pretty much every founding father is a Federalist. Maybe, I don't know, Patrick Henry's not so excited about it because he smelled a rat, but pretty much every founding father is a Federalist. Madison's a Federalist, Jefferson's a Federalist, Hamilton's a Federalist, Adams is a Federalist. Did I say Washington? I probably did. So all of the, the big guys are Federalists in this era because they all favor the ratification of the Constitution. Now, once we get presidents, Federalists become a political party, and then they're not all Federalists. But during this era, they're all Federalists in the constitutional era because they want the ratification of the Constitution. And anti-federalists are guys who oppose the ratification of the Constitution because they think it is going to erode states' rights. And they're correct. It is. That's the whole purpose of the Constitution, is to erode states. Well, should I have said it that way? No, it's not to erode states' rights. It's to limit states' rights to protect minority opinions and to protect one state from another, to regulate interstate commerce. So it's really to limit state rights and protect federal authority, autonomy, that sort of thing. I don't know that I've made a good argument there. But the anti-federalists, no, they do not want the Constitution. And you see pretty large groups of anti-federalists in certain states. Probably the biggest group of them is in New York. New York. That's why Alexander Hamilton and John Jay are going to have to make the big arguments. Yeah. All right. Patrick Henry's not excited about the Constitution. So he's an anti-federalist. Sam Adams, John Hancock, yeah, with the big signature. And a lot of small farmers feel like this is going to be bad for them. They're concerned. Now, the anti-federalists aren't just like, we don't like this. They're going to, issue some editorials as well. And one of the biggest things that they are going to do is add or insist on a Bill of Rights. They feel like individual liberties are not protected because there's no specific Bill of Rights or list of individual liberties that need to be protected. Now, Madison, the guy who's the principal author of the Constitution, thinks that's completely unnecessary because he thinks the document itself and the philosophy of the document itself protects individual rights. However, if New York, Massachusetts, and Virginia, all pretty large, important states economically as well, have enough dissenters that they won't vote for this new constitution, then it's not going to be ratified. So in particular, to appease New York, they agreed to add a Bill of Rights, a Bill of Rights, a list of unalienable rights that every individual person has. Yeah. Even though Madison thought that was completely unnecessary, he wrote the Bill of Rights, probably so it would sound like the same style, plus he's Madison and he's the Constitution nerd. So he, wants to have his hand on that, even though he doesn't necessarily agree to it. Now, when New York agrees to ratify the Constitution, they agree to ratify it with a promise of adding the Bill of Rights later, which they do. I would like for you to notice, because I know we don't always trust politicians, do we? Here we have a group of politicians essentially who have promised two things. One, what are the two things that they promised? One, they promised to end the slave trade in 20 years, which they do. Two, they promised to add a Bill of Rights if you agree to ratify this now, which they do. So these are guys who make promises that they follow through on. And yes, they're groups of politicians. So I think nowadays, if we made a political deal, like, I don't know, they're arguing about the infrastructure thing. So if the Republicans said, we'll agree to this infrastructure bill if you promise that in 5 years we'll build a wall, or whatever it is that Republicans want to do. And so the Democrats go like, sure, we'll build a wall in 5 years. No one would believe that in 5 years a wall would be built. No one believes that. But during this era, it's the era of political virtue. You got to follow through on your words. Now, that does not mean there aren't some rowdy things that are going on in politics during this time period. They have some pretty rough elections, and sorry for the yawn, call each other some pretty bad names and make some pretty harsh allegations against, and some scandalous stuff too, that is often not true. However, in this era, when they're creating the Constitution and they're building up the government, they really want to succeed. So they tend to work together when they can and follow through on their promises on stuff that they think is crucial to the founding of the Republic. They also did think about slavery, that this was not their generation's problem to solve, that they really thought the next generation of politicians would solve that problem. They were clearly incorrect about that, because the next politician or generation of politicians wasn't all about solving problems. They were about other things. Okay. So there's a lot of discussion about who is supposed to be a citizen during this time period, how who gets to vote. Are Native Americans included in citizenship? And they are not. Most people did not see Native Americans as fit for citizenship. They didn't possess any individual rights. They didn't, because they weren't, they didn't have rights. They didn't have the opportunity to vote, that sort of thing. The goal is to not have too many fights with Native Americans, at least in the initial days, and to sign treaties. And in those treaties, the nations typically ceded their land and then moved farther west, and maybe were paid for the land through annuities, that kind of thing. Typically, these treaties they didn't have a lot of options, so they kind of signed. And gradual emancipation in the North is not uncommon. Certainly, as we've talked about several times, there are lots of people in the founding generation who thought it was time to get rid of slavery. The book mentions specifically founding fathers Hamilton, Jay, Franklin, who worked very hard and established a manumission society, a society to promote abolition during this time period. But citizenship is going to be restricted over time by the Congress in naturalization acts. It's not written into the Constitution, but it gives Congress the power to define citizenship, and Congress will define citizenship as only open to people who are free and white. So as time goes along, people who did have voting rights in states like New Jersey or Vermont or some of the northern states, people who were former slaves who did gain voting rights are going to lose those voting rights. And then the book is going to talk a little bit about Jefferson and his philosophy on race, which Jefferson's a brilliant guy, but not in, you'll look at this discussion and go like, really, did he think this? He really did think that people who were of African descent maybe were not as intelligent for a variety of reasons. And if you read some of the notes on Virginia, he'll discuss those. And he thinks that race, heredity, environment, and intelligence are all tied together. And if somebody had been enslaved, their ability to operate as citizens, to gain intellectual prowess, is going to be harmed to the point where it's not going to be possible for them to be equal. That will lead to a discussion, an intellectual discussion, exchange of letters between Benjamin Banneker, who's a pretty noted scientist, mathematician during this time period, city planner, and Jefferson, and they will exchange letters and books and things like that. And Jefferson in many ways will publicly acknowledge that Benjamin Banneker is a brilliant fellow. The book mentions that privately he doubts that he did all of his own work. Like, way to go, Jefferson. So Jefferson also, of course, pretty famously is going to father children with one of his slaves. His wife died pretty young, she died really young. And so Sally Hemings is going to help raise his two daughters, and then they are going to end up having several children of his own, of their own. And apparently that was a consensual relationship. So, and he will end up freeing some of those children, but most not. And part of the reason the book mentions too is he doesn't free more people is he's in debt, which tended to be the case for people in this era. They tended to, because inflation was a real problem, and they tended to spend more money than they had. Yeah, there's a lot of personal debt during this time period. All right, so if you're wondering, like at the end of the discussion about the Constitution, who is considered to be eligible for citizenship? Free white men. That's pretty much it. So that's half the country, about, not quite, no, not quite. Because women don't have rights as citizens, men who are not white don't have rights as citizens. But it leaves the United States with an expansion of a definition of citizenship, an expansion of the right to vote, but not to the extent, anywhere close to the modern era. More so than European nations, it's more free in a lot of ways there. There are fewer property owning requirements, better opportunity to own property, to have a voice in your government. You have a government that's more directly elected by the people. It has many checks and balances. It has the promise of freedom and the ability to make changes to make things more free as time goes along. But it's really, it's a beginning. It's, yeah. And I think the fact that they're openly discussing the flaws of the system is an idea that they understand that those flaws need to be corrected. Now, is it acceptable to abolitionists, to people who are enslaved? Of course not. Is it acceptable to women? Of course not. As time goes along, will those groups make lots of changes? Yes. So, and does the government they created give them the ability to make those changes? Yes. So, it's a mixed bag of stuff. Mixed bag of stuff. Yeah, that's a brilliant conclusion, isn't it? All right, so let's look at the question over this chapter for a minute or two. Let me reopen that. And let me know if you have questions. I know we're almost done. That was your question. Are you almost done? I am. Yeah, that's the document thing. Unit 2 questions. Here we go. All right. I forgot to put my phone farther away today. It's right next to me and it just keeps ringing. No one ever calls me except during class. Isn't that bizarre? You're going like, no, it's not bizarre at all. All right, thanks. All right, if you decide to do the Constitution question, oh, tomorrow's John Marshall question. I love John Marshall. Not, I don't really know him or anything like that. But I would look at probably the place where it talks the most about division of powers, that sort of thing. Pages, let's see, 264 to probably about 267 or so. That's probably where I would look for that. If you're talking about this, make sure, excuse me, that you talk about federalism, balance and separation, spiration. I'm the worst typist. Of powers, checks and balances, that sort of thing. But talk about the sharing of power between federalism, sharing between federal and state government. Talk about the balance of power between the different branches and separation of powers and the checks and balances. So where, there can be vetoes or overriding vetoes, or the Supreme Court can look at the constitutionality of certain laws as well. And we didn't go over, I just thought about this, we didn't really go over the Bill of Rights individually, like what all of the things in the Bill of Rights are. But you can also mention that to meet the concerns of the anti-federalist, you can talk about the Bill of Rights being added. And I didn't mention to you what the Bill of Rights was. Sorry, my assumption is, they know that. And you probably do, but just in case. First, 10 amendments to the Constitution. So James Madison proposes 11 amendments and they accept 10. The 11th one later becomes the 27th. It's the one that says, if Congress gives itself a raise, they don't get it, the next Congress does. So interesting, perhaps, that we would wait a couple hundred years to pass an amendment, but whatever, we took our time and thought about it. The first 10 amendments protect individual liberties, protect the rights of the accused, and also define what happens when rights are not specified. So First Amendment, protects speech and press and assembly and petition and religion, not in that order. Second Amendment, the favorite one in Texas, is the right to own weapons. And you know that it wasn't for hunting. You know that. It was to protect yourself against a government that was out of control. That really is the discussion that they had. So when you hear your friends who talk about that really, but we also built into the system elections. So yeah, so there you go. Third Amendment is to prevent the quartering of soldiers. Fourth Amendment says that there has to be probable cause or a warrant to search, seize, arrest, that sort of thing. The Fifth Amendment protects your rights to due process and a variety of other things too. Eminent domain, you can't testify, can be forced to testify against yourself. That's when you plead the Fifth, that sort of thing. Probably due process is the most important part of the Fifth Amendment, that you can't be denied life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Probably the most crucial part of that. 6, 7, and 8 have to do with your rights at trial. 6 and 7, you can have a lawyer and witnesses in either a lawsuit or a criminal case. 8th Amendment, no cruel or unusual punishment. 9th Amendment says that if they didn't list any rights that you had, that you get those as well. And 10th Amendment says if they didn't specifically assign powers to the federal government, that those powers belong to the state, local, or governments or the individual. There you go. So there's a lot of stuff in there. It's really important stuff. Madison's thought about the Bill of Rights, and then I'm done, I promise. Madison's thought about the Bill of Rights was it was unnecessary because he believed in the idea of negative law. So if the rights aren't listed, then you automatically have all of them. Once you start listing rights, then if you leave one out, you don't have them. So that's more the idea of positive law, that you have to make a list of the rights you have or powers. So that's why Madison throws in the 9th and 10th, because the 9th is, oh, if I forgot a right, you get that one as well. And 10th is if I didn't list a power that the state or local government has, they also get that one too. So those were the Madison's a nervous guy. He might have left something out, amendments, 9th and 10th. All right. Oh my goodness. I felt like I've talked today for like 2 years, so I apologize if it felt that way to you. Constitution, though, important stuff. It was Constitution Day, even though I forgot. Now, before we go, let me check the roll one more time. Let me see if you have any questions. Do you have any questions? You're going like, please, no one ask a question.